Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, first we're going to address the elephant in the room. My esteemed co-hosts aren't here today because they would be bored out of their minds. There's not enough pew-pews and stuff and a topic like, creating realistic geopolitical organizations for fictional worlds. It almost sounds like someone's dissertation. And all of us on this esteemed panel are guilty and recovering academics. So it's sort of our penance to ourselves. It's sort of like, say a dozen Hail Marys, or I don't know, does the LDS do the equivalent, Joe? Do you got like a Hail Mary you got to do?
Oh, I don't know. We do. I don't know. There's something. There's a few things. Yeah, I guess.
So this
there's somewhere.
Yeah, they're in there somewhere. We'll pay for this later, but we're going to have fun. And if we bore you, we apologize for nothing. And with that out of the way, our esteemed panelists of guests, I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So, Mr. J. Daniel Sawyer, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Oh, my name is J. Daniel Sawyer. I write mystery, science fiction, and nonfiction, including a blog on this very subject at called Unfolding the World at jdanielsawyer.substack.com.
Nice. And next, we've got Mr. Joe Vasicek.
Yes, I also write science fiction and fantasy, mostly science fiction, under my Joe Vasicek name. I've been writing and indie publishing for about 10, 12 years now, and it's been a lot of fun. And I guess on the topic of this subject, I was cursed that I got a political science degree, and then I graduated and my real education began. Spent some time in the Middle East, spent some time teaching English in Georgia. I was actually in Georgia when they had the president. Basically, they had the election there that kind of started the beginning of the end for the president Saakashvili there. So that was kind of interesting.
The country, not the state, for those of you who are uncultured.
Yeah, exactly. Although I don't know if they can read as much English in Georgia, I don't know. But so I've had a little bit of experience traveling around and seeing things, and it's just an interest of mine. So,
okay, we got Mr. Rick Shaw next.
Rick Shaw, indie author, recovering professional geek, retired now for 8 months. My first novel came out earlier this year, The Tandeska Deception. My second novel, Genesis Renewed, will come out sometime next month. Yeah, next month, to have it in time for 20 books.
Nice. Congratulations. And last, technically this is airing in November on election week. So if you're sick of politics of the real world, you can dive into politics of fake worlds. And last but not least, we got Rob Howell.
Is this going to air November 2023 or 2024?
2023, but there isn't there like local elections this year? I seem to remember getting.
Yeah. I will be pleasantly surprised if there are elections in 2024 this week, but maybe that's another subject. So
yeah, the After Dark version of the podcast.
That will take us way out of the realm of attempting to be phenomenological and nonpartisan.
That is true. Anyway, sorry about that.
All right, and we've got Mr. Rob Howell.
Hello, I'm Rob Howell. I write fantasy and military science fiction and whatever comes to mind, whatever anybody asks me to write, because writing is fun. And if they give me a good challenge, I enjoy it. With respect to geopolitical stuff, I am all but dissertation in medieval history, having studied a good deal amount of variety of different medieval political situations.
And so I have my bachelor's degree in ancient and medieval history with a focus on military tactics. And then I got my almost done with my master's degree. I literally just had to write and defend my dissertation because Villanova requires that for history master's degree in colonial American history. I had written the first draft of my dissertation on the Conway Cabal. And then Uncle Sugar sent me to war and I got blown up 35 times. And it makes it really, really hard to focus on academics. So I decided that maybe I would try my hand at other things. So all of us, like I said, we're all recovering academics, and hopefully you can go along with us on this ride in the crazy train. So this podcast started because we were talking in the after show, Rob Howell and I, and then I mentioned it to J. Daniel Sawyer about the idea of politics could be fun. And incidentally, separate from that, Joe had suggested that as a topic, hey, it could be fun talking about, geopolitics in fictional worlds. And so independently, we all came up with the same idea at different times. And so I said, if people keep coming up with this idea, maybe we should just get off our butts and do it. And then I just I dragged Rick along for the ride because we needed a pretty face.
And you got one.
So, all right. So who wants to start us off? So what's the first thing? Because obviously there are times when you read about political organizations that you look at them and it's so stupid. It's like, how does that even function? Right. Like famously, I'll think of the Covenant. Like
I thought we were doing theoretical.
We all. So, for instance, the Covenant in Halo, like it was a great enemy as far as video games, but why they are all going to commit mass cultural suicide for some floating blobs that is basically like a skinnier version of Jabba the Hutt that can't actually attack them. Like they need the minions more than the minions need them. Somehow they all go along with it because religion, wave your hands in the air. And it just lacked nuance. I think partly that's because it started as a video game. You didn't really need that kind of depth. But when you write something and you want it done right, I'll use that as a counter. Dune, the governments he created there, Dune, yes. Like they were very in depth. It was believable, and he took into consideration, okay, if this culture developed in this setting, what would they be like? And then you add in this tech, and what would change? And so he didn't just plug and play. He factored in where they were because, quite frankly, as a culture evolves in a desert, water is going to be more of a priority than other things, and it's going to change your culture. I mean, it has to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the thing he did well, and that Frank Herbert did really well in Dune, was he built a lot of the kind of groundwork for the stuff that would fuel the politics. Before he didn't start with the politics, he started with the very basic stuff, like how does space travel work, and how does the computers work, or the lack of computers, the lack of computers, lack of robots, and he did all the kind of things that kind of where are the resources, the shortages, and what are the resources that are really valuable that everybody wants, and and then from that he kind of built things up, which I thought was really what worked there. Yeah.
I think that's an absolutely great point. I mentioned earlier before we were live that I look for kinetic and potential energy spots. And one of the best places for potential energy are shortages of important resources. And Dune, you're absolutely right. There are two crucial resources that their shortages intertwined that there's so much energy to the politics of all that just inherent in every bit of the storytelling. So it's a great job of world building, making spice and water be this interchangeable, not interchangeable, but intertwined mixture of shortages.
In studying real-world geopolitics, I suppose we should define this for the audience. Geopolitics is a specific subdiscipline of political analysis that looks at the way geography, technology, and culture, geography, technology, culture, demography, and economics affect the grand strategy game. And key to all of those are constraints. If you start with what your constraints are, and your constraints are determined by the resources that your civilization needs versus the resources that are available, and you work up, you sort of build out from there, keeping the interplay of those things in mind. Christian civilization coming forward from Rome went through several phases, all of them defined by the constraints they were operating under. The constraints affected the technology that was developed, because the technology developed in order to solve constraint problems. Those created further constraint problems, which affected demography and the flow of capital, which then affected the political structures. And for example, the Republican city-states around the Mediterranean rising in power, while the autocratic city-states and fiefdoms and principates in Northern Europe falling in power because they couldn't allocate capital and access seaports as well as the people around the Mediterranean. And so the relative power shifted with the relative wealth, and as part of an attempt to catch up, the Northern Europeans started adopting, starting with Amsterdam, adopting the government and that affected the way that they could develop because of the way that power was distributed among their various silos of power that affected economics, that affected social customs, and all that sort of stuff.
And in crafting story, for the writers who are listening to this, who are looking for all the key cool stuff, don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. Stories like the one that immediately comes to mind is Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. Okay, set in the 12th century England, marvelous book set in the 12th century of England during the Wars of Succession between Stephen and Maud and that crowd. But the majority of the story is a little shire and a little cathedral and the politics between the earl and the priory and the community. And the geopolitics, if you will, are all happening outside of it and impacting it. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel and write a whole new system to have a really good, complex story.
And I'll give you another one that pops right into exactly what you just talked about. Earlier today, I watched a Cadfael. If you haven't watched the Cadfael Mysteries on BBC, they're excellent.
The books are also excellent. Yeah, by Ellis Peters. Great stuff. Ellis
Peters, who was a cryptographer for the British Secret Service during World War II, by the way. She was trying to help break codes involving the Czechs.
Was she part of Bletchley Park?
I think so, yeah. Or at least she was affiliated with all of that intel work at the time. But the point being, though, is that here you have mysteries. They are murder mysteries, one or two murders, but are surrounding all of that is the conflict between Stephen and Maud. And a lot of the mysteries are have some sort of impact from the whole English Civil War that's going on at the time, which is exactly what did happen in places like Shrewsbury. The impact of the big, which most of the people didn't really want to deal with that, but how can you not when countries being torn like that? So there's another perfect example of how to use the big to make your small have a little bit of extra texture.
Yeah, Joe threw in Hunger Games in the chat. It's another excellent example.
That's a bad example, yeah. Because every single district produces just one thing, and it's just really poorly done. And the thing that really got me upset about Hunger Games, though, was at the very end when it's like there's this like love, the sappy love story between the two, like the baker and then the tribute girl or whatever, and then they're about to commit suicide together because they're like the last two survivors, and then there's like the loudspeaker, like the guy who's supposed to be in charge of the games, that he says, like, oh, you both need to fight each other to death, and then they say, okay, we'll just commit suicide together. And then on that moment, like with the whole country watching, the guy says, oh no, we didn't mean that. You don't have to do that. And that's so stupid because if you're a ruler, you've got to save face, and if you can't save face and things like that, if it basically is that kind of a move would demonstrate to your people that, oh, we can rise up. And of course, that became a plot point in the later books. But I'm just thinking, you don't become an evil dictator by doing that. You become an evil dictator by dropping like gasoline barrels full of shrapnel and explosives on civilian targets and just blowing them up because you need to teach people a lesson, or you do it by doing some of the really dark things we see in the Middle East that a lot of the regimes there have done.
Well, but you can measure. I mean, we're talking about classical sources. You can measure the success or failure of a political leader, particularly a despot, by how closely they pay attention to Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, and von Clausewitz.
Yeah.
No matter the governmental system, a leader that pays attention to those three thinkers will be successful, no matter how despotic or benevolent he is. And a leader that does not, whatever success he achieves will be fragile and it will not scale.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of, there's actually a really good video on YouTube that really describes it. It's by CGP Grey. It's called Rules for Rulers, where he breaks down, like, this is like, like the reason why despots operate the way they do. They're not just evil, horrible people and you would do much better if you were in position. No, like they have people under them that they have to satisfy. So they have to gather the resources, but to do that, they have to like basically steal them from the people or do however they get them. And so And so he basically explains the mechanics of how that works. So if you really, for a real primer on just the basics of like how dictatorships, and not just dictatorships, also democracies, like how these governments work and why they end up doing things that people look and say, oh, that's such an evil regime. I would definitely recommend watching The Rules for Rulers by CGP Grey on YouTube. He got it from a book. I'm not sure which book he got it from, but he was reading a book and I needed a video about that.
The other thing that really plays in that wasn't in my original list is ideology. Because the ideology of the ruling class or the aspiring ruling class really influences what parts of the world they can see. And in seeing it, how they decide to deal with it. One of the great classic examples of this is Hitler, who nobody reads about what he was thinking or why he was such a nutbag, because he was the bad guy. But Hitler subscribed to an economic theory of history that was derivative from Marxism and had gone off in a different direction, that basically said that the only way for a nation to be secure was to be an autarky, to have all of your production, all of your resources, everything in-house. And any country that didn't do this, either through having a unified central core or through having an empire that they could subjugate, was destined for the dustbin of history. Coming out of the disaster of the late 19th century with Bismarck, and then the disaster of World War I, all of that following on the disaster of the 30 Years' War, Hitler was very interested, most primarily interested, if you actually read his writings, in securing the territorial integrity of Germany. But because of the stupid economic theory he subscribed to, he couldn't imagine a way to do that that didn't involve conquering all of Eastern Europe out basically to Moscow, because that's where all the farmland is. And without the farmland, he couldn't feed his people, especially because he didn't believe in capitalist science, which had actually taken a German invention, the Haber-Bosch process, and figured out how to make fields more fertile so that the footprint of the farms in Germany could actually have fed the Germans.
So Netherlands hadn't yet become as productive as it is today.
Right. And without understanding that ideological piece of the puzzle, nothing Hitler did makes sense. It just seems like he was a madman, but madmen don't execute a coup and take over one of the most powerful countries in the world and then keep the most powerful empire in the world at bay for 8 or 9 years while invading all the other most powerful empires in the world and kicking their asses. Madmen don't do that, but people who have stupid ideas but good instincts do.
So if you're looking for another fictional creation that has an example of political organizations that just don't make any sense, if you've seen the movie or read the book Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard,
Oh God,
the whole invasion species, it's just like, how the hell did they enslave anybody? They can barely. It just doesn't make any sense. The culture didn't make sense. None of it, like, it wasn't balanced. It's this idea, and you see it a lot in fiction, be it screen, film, comics, whatever, where it's like, okay, I'm going to create alien race. We will call them the Shautonians, because I'm looking at the middle where Rick Shaw's picture is. We're going to call them the Shautonians, and the Shautonians are all 5 foot tall and afraid of the dark. And so every one of your Shautonian aliens are going to be 5 foot. No, because there's always variance within each. I mean, even look at deer. They don't all look the same. Bears, they don't all look the same. There's variance within every species.
Even the Klingons have scientists.
What's that?
Even the Klingons have scientists.
That's right.
Exactly. Although another example of a society that didn't make any sense. If they're warring that much, how did they survive long enough to get to space and develop, the technology that they had to become a conquering race that somehow still got their ass kicked?
I'm sorry, JR. I've got to stop you there because Europe is the ultimate argument against that.
They're just fighting each other all the time, and eventually they.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's instructive looking at the difference between Europe and China through the Middle Ages. China was far more advanced. They had to be in order to keep some semblance of a country together over such a wide area with so few navigable rivers and such a water problem. and so many ethnic groups and geographies.
And arable land issues.
Yeah, and arable land issues. They developed very early some of the most sophisticated political governance systems in the world. And because they did that, they were able, through genocide and governance, to create a monoculture across that whole area, which kills all innovation. Europe was impossible to unite. There's too many resources. There's too easy access to seaports. There's too many of the wrong kinds of geographical barriers that keep the language groups separate. And because of that, they're always at war. So everybody's always got an incentive to up their technology so they can get a better deal and get one over on their neighbor, whom is their ally when they're weak and their enemy when they're strong. That competition is what fuels what we in the West now take for granted as the technological ascent treadmill. Without that level of interstate competition and warfare, there is no going to the stars. Even going to the moon was a PR stunt designed by the Americans to humiliate the Russians. And as soon as we made the point, we stopped going because it was a military program that accomplished its objective.
Well, I do wonder what military programs are going on right now that we're going to hear about 20 years from now. I mean, there's military planes that are going up for like years at a time and coming back down. We have no idea what they're doing.
Well, we're already seeing some of it in the reports of aliens.
Exactly what they're doing.
So if this is being filmed in October, and we've just gotten done with all the alien hearings, and I'm struck with all the times people would see in the 80s these triangular shapes that just look so weird flying around, and then sure enough, after the first Gulf War, whoa, what are these strange planes that just won the war?
Yeah.
It's the
Stealth bombers. Yep.
And then now everyone that had the alien sighting is no, it was totally different. I think a lot of that is military research already, but. So,
as somebody who lives in Aerospace Central, the Lancaster Palmdale area where all of that stuff was built and developed, Lockheed Skunk Works is 20 minutes from my house. Mm-hmm. It's I'm sorry, as a geek, it's cool to drive across town and go, oh, look, there's a B-2. Or, F-35, or they're going to be building the new strategic bomber, the B-21 here. It's no surprise, and it wasn't just the Nevada desert that it was flying over.
No. Well, what I was thinking of specifically was, I forget what it's called, like the X something. There's like, I know they have, I forget which branch of the military it is, but I know they have a space plane. I mean, it went up into space for like 220 days and it came down again. And
the X-35B.
Yeah, that's the one. And so it's like they've got to be doing. Really, they could be putting different satellites in. They could be putting different systems up. I mean, things that we wouldn't. They could be doing some climate things. I don't know.
Long-term spy platform surveillance.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And I know. I read the book George Friedman's Next 100 Years, and he was talking about speculating how space would be like a really big. And he kind of game planned he's like, I can't really make predictions, but I can write kind of a fictional projection about what the next big war. And he said it would happen in 2050, and there would be like there'd be a lot of space warfare going on with these platforms that they've built, also with energy systems. But I mean, we could be building that kind of infrastructure, and they find it convenient not to make it public what's happening.
Well, if you look at the financials for Starlink, you realize that Starlink is a financial loser. It will never make money unless there is an undisclosed customer on the back end. That, of course, has to be the DoD and the NSA.
Or
otherwise,
the colony that they left on Mars that we don't know about officially, or the one on the dark side of the moon that Nazis left up there. I've seen the B movies. They're really documentaries, people.
Nazis on. Yep.
Wasn't there like an Israeli general who came out and said, I don't care about this. I'm 80 years old. I'm going to die anyways. We've contacted aliens and we made a treaty with them on Mars or something like that.
Yeah, I think that guy was off his meds.
Yeah.
He had to be.
But I just want to know, because that sounds like they were the good stuff. You know what I mean? So one of the things you see a lot of, and everyone talks about it here, is this concept of the one world government, right? And is there a point where do you think, in a culture, because we're talking, either fantasy settings or, sci-fi settings, the difference is expansive areas of governance where one world, one singular organizational structure ever makes sense.
In an environment with hostile extraterrestrials, a one world government would inevitably arise, and it would have to be done up along the lines of the way the Catholic Church divvied up Europe in the 20th or in the medieval era. That's the only preserving what they called it was subsidiary, and preserving that devolved regional competence is the only way to make a system that large work over the long term.
So basically, what we have, where the states after the Civil War essentially became bureaucratic arms of the larger federal state, as opposed to independent sovereignty.
No. The way it was before the Civil War was modeled on Catholic subsidiarity. After the Civil War, what happened was Lincoln. This all comes back to Hegel. This is where ideology comes back into it. So Hegel had this idea that that he was trying to figure out basically how to bring God back into philosophy, and because science had destroyed God, but humans obviously needed God. So Hegel's idea was that God basically is the end point of human evolution. So we will only know God and the mind of God and be in contact with God once we are all united politically in a superorganism. Lincoln was a major student of Hegel. He was a correspondent of Marx. And so for Reconstruction, a Hegelian program was followed, which the idea was to strip the states of their of a lot of their autonomy and move things toward the federal level. And then the American progressives, spearheaded by Woodrow Wilson, picked up that ball and ran with it. Ironically, they were all Southerners at the time, but on the theory of if you can't beat them, do it better and take the power away from them. So they swept in and accelerated the trend, and then the northern response to that was FDR, and it's been going back and forth. The
Europeans were also involved in that too. I mean, there was with the Fabian Society, and then they formed the Council on Foreign Relations, which did a lot of this.
Council on Foreign Relations is a U.S. think tank, as is
but it was connected with the British. I forget what it's called.
Bertrand Russell was involved in putting that together, as was what's his Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who was also a Fabian.
Yeah.
But that the directionality of the world towards a state of one world government over the last 150 years is entirely a product of Hegel getting really popular in the academy in the early and mid 19th century. The problem with Hegel is that he had a religious vision and not a political vision, and so the stripping of powers from lower levels of the subsidiarity means that the more centralized the authority structure gets, the less it's able to actually cope with the reality on the ground. And so you've been seeing over the 20th century this tendency for states to centralize and then collapse, which is exactly what happened in the ancient world, on about the same time scale that happened in the ancient world. What the Catholics in the medieval world were able to figure out through necessity, because they didn't have high-speed communications and they had to unite barbarians and Romans and Byzantines and whatnot, was that if you sank power down to as local a level as possible, the Pope could basically run the whole show, but leave the details of all the implementations to the localities, and they could implement whatever the policy was in a way that the locals could stomach. And that's a incredibly effective governance paradigm. And the founding fathers of the U.S. stole it. And to the extent that the current system is teetering and tottering and not doing well, it's because the authority at all lower levels of the bureaucracy has been stripped away. George Friedman, to plug another one of his books, The Storm Before the Calm, goes into the dysfunction of the evaporation of subsidiarity in great depth in that book.
So speaking of the subsidiary that you mentioned, so you're talking about the way the U.S. was organized as an example before the Civil War, where each state was essentially an independent entity. If we push that to the stars, where each planet becomes an independent sovereign entity unified under a larger organization, is it truly a one world or one galaxy, whatever government, or is it a confederation of smaller unified governments? And is there a distinction?
Well,
There is.
my question
There is
sorry,
a
go ahead.
distinction. I think that the biggest thing that you have to worry about, and he mentioned it earlier, is communication possibilities. In the Middle Ages, of course, we have communication distances that really add up to lengthy challenges. Well, are we going to find some way to do faster than light travel? And if we do, how fast is that faster than light? Is it days to Alpha Centauri? Is it weeks to Alpha Centauri? Is it months? And then if it is months, now we're starting to talk about the same kind of time frames as some of the empires in the 1700s had to deal with, and because of that, then we have to start talking about the challenges of the local governments. How much do you give them in terms of autonomy? Because sooner or later, that local government's the leaders of that local government are gonna take advantage of that, because that's human beings. And so one of the most important things you have to develop when you're developing a world, if you're going to develop empires, you need to have some idea of what kind of communication networks you can build. Are you going to have magic allow you to communicate over long distances? If you do, how expensive is it? How common is it? I have that in my setting where there is a way to talk over long distances, but it's very rare, and it's only certain mages that can do it. And therefore, it is kind of, it's not used for anything except a very large scale, wealthy individuals, government type things, and then not all that often. So it's there, but not used a ton. So you've got to figure that out. Otherwise, you can't figure out some of the responses that your local governments are going to do.
So, Joe, you had something to weigh in on that one before we devolved?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking one example of communication and transportation in space opera is really key, and that'll reshape everything. Depending on, can you get to planets within like a week or two, or do you have to have like a time dilation, or do you have to send generation ships? One series I think did really interesting things with that was Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, where you have instantaneous communication through the Ansible device, which he stole from Ursula K. Le Guin, and then kind of hang a lampshade on that by calling it the Ansible device. But then like travel is still sublight, so it still takes years and years, and you will, with the time dilation, you can go through like millennia, going from star to star, but all of these different places can communicate with each other instantaneously. So he did some very interesting things with that.
One of my favorite examples of transportation is David Drake's Lieutenant Leary series, which not only does it give you the limitations of communication of the 17th century, 18th century, early 19th century, it also gives you this neat tool for his characters to grow in, with Lieutenant Leary being able to be up there and slightly shave time off by checking through these other universes. It's really fascinating why he did it. That becomes integral to that entire series.
And
earlier, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say Rick was going to weigh in a second ago. I want to make sure you got a chance to talk.
Sorry, Rick.
It's all right, man. There are a couple of things. The generation ship has always bugged me, because with the way technology evolves, I'm going to build a generation ship, I'm going to head out, and 50 years later, somebody's going to build something much faster and get there before them. But that
Great plot point in a lot of Golden Age science fiction too.
Very much so. What we haven't touched yet is corporate colonization, and the notion of the East India Company.
Yep.
The East India Company goes asteroid mining, or establishes a colony on Enceladus, or pick something. And then you run into, again, the time lag for communication, the distance to get there and actually govern, if they're subject to a governing body of any sort. I, in many ways, suggest the East India Company wasn't.
And that ties back in. JR had asked what if common if one world or a common government means anything, or if it's just a confederation. And I can give you a historical parallel where you can see the difference between a confederation and a united wide government. And that's look at the history of the United States versus the history of Canada. The United States is a federal system because, as opposed to a confederal system, because it has internal free trade and internally consistent property laws, and the Canadian and also a joint defense zone. The Canadian system until the 90s didn't have an internal free trade agreement. It kind of had a united military. It's never been a united country until just very recently, and it's not all that united now. It sort of stepped out onto the world stage with a common face, with the Canadian flag and the Canadian military, but there is no Canada in the way that there is a United States or a Britain.
Have you heard about how Alberta's the rat-free province?
No, I haven't heard about that.
So something like the Northern European rat was like spreading, and they want really in Alberta they've got all the agriculture, and so the province there was like, they basically created a firewall where there's like a several mile zone between like the border with the east there to basically prevent the rats from coming over and also coming up from America, and they're like really meticulous about making sure that if they get an infection of rats, they will like clamp down on it really fast, but they advertise themselves as the rat-free province. So it's kind of the same thing where it's like each one is kind of like more independent and trying to do their own thing. I'm sure it wreaks all kinds of havoc on trying to like ship things around in there. But yeah.
Well, let me give you a perfect example of transportation challenges because of Canada in Canada. If you are driving the Trans-Canada Highway in Ontario going to Quebec, you get to the Quebec border, and within 3 miles, you are suddenly going from interstate speeds to 30 clicks an hour is the speed limit.
Oh my God.
You immediately go through a town. This is the Trans-Canada Highway. And there's really not like there's not like this huge, there are signs, of course, but there's no huge delineation that says, oh, you're getting off of the highway. No, all of a sudden, the speed limits are going down and now you're going 30 clicks an hour as opposed to 110. It's that dramatic. The United States viewpoints of how fast we can get across the country through interstates is not at all mirrored by the Canadians.
They have one road. One road goes the whole way across.
Pretty much. Now, to be fair, that one road goes through 95% of the population, I believe.
Right, because all the population lives right near the video.
Right, yeah.
Or right near the border.
Yeah. But again, it's still there's an ideological viewpoint there, the American expectation of being able to get in our car and drive. The Canadians don't, they have it, but not to the same extent.
So we're going to take that. We're going to take that moment. We're going to do a blunt force segue. We're going to pause while we shamelessly shill for the man, and then we'll jump back when the commercial's over.
What will you do when the world goes belly up? Will you paint stripes on your cheeks, grab your flaming guitar, and enjoy the glorious post-apocalypse party? Or will you gnash your teeth and wail at the loss of civilization? Either way, we've a story for you. This post-apocalyptic collection has 15 great stories, each with its own spin on our future. Dive right into From the Ashes, a Bayonet Books anthology, before the future becomes now.
All right, thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. So we were talking about the confluence of, the concept of a one world government with the needs of transportation and communication. And you were mentioning Canada as an example because they have the one highway system that they've got. I will say that regardless of whether
it's one highway.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's
highway.
Two lanes on each side across the shield. It's not very big.
I've driven it.
There are places it's bigger. It's 16 lanes in Toronto.
Well, that's why I said across the shield.
Yeah.
Across the Canadian shield.
Yeah.
So I would say that at a certain point in time, things like the ability to communicate would change drastically the way course of events play out. And so when novelizations in fictional worlds don't factor that in, it shows. So, for instance, a lot of what happened where Commodore Dewey opened up the Orient for America, does it happen the same way if he's got Uncle Sugar peering over his shoulder because he's got instantaneous satellite communications? I would argue probably not. There's going to be more micromanaging. And so you're going to end up with a lot of bureaucrats making decisions in all rights they probably have no business making. You're going to see that extrapolated writ large to a quantum entanglement society where you've got the ability to talk from here to Alpha Centauri with no delay, or a magical setting where you click your heels 3 times and Dorothy can talk to Toto, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, look at the difference between Dewey opening up the Orient, or even World Wars I and II, and the way the U.S. coordinated strategy in those situations, versus the absolute, complete strategic failure of every United States engagement since Vietnam. Aside from Grenada, the reason for that is the communications are so good that you don't need good generals anymore. The Joint Chiefs and the president can micromanage everything, but they're not good generals because they haven't been through a major war.
And if you want a fictional example of this, read the Retief series by Keith Laumer. It's brilliant about talking about how bad bureaucrats are in the whole.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of world building, the really important aspect of this is bureaucrats aren't bad at this because they're bureaucrats. They're bad at this because they are bureaucrats and not the other things, these specialists that deal with these things. That's why after World War II, up until Vietnam, when you had the entire economy really staffed by former military from a successful war, from a total war, there was competence through the system. So no matter what your political opinions on the way the system was organized by Roosevelt, it could work because everybody was well trained, everybody was highly specialized, everybody knew what they were doing. And by the time you get to Vietnam, that starts to fall apart because people are retiring and they're dying off, and the competent people hired their proteges based on the fact that they were their proteges, not because they were the best people for the job.
Never forget Parnell's iron law bureaucracy.
It exists to perpetuate itself. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the people who are good at the mission are going to get pushed out by the people who are focused on the
politics. Yeah.
And you rise to I forget what the law's called, but you rise to the level of your incompetence and bureaucracy.
The Peter principle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, Rick, you were saying the corporate thing, and when you're in a corporate civilization, you've got this interesting divorce between the corporation running governance for anything that the corporation cares about, and then everybody else having to figure out how to run their society elsewise. You see that in India under the British East India Company. You kind of see that in England with the development of common law in the Middle Ages, because the crown, what did the crown care about?
Revenues.
War. As long as everyone practiced and gave no fucks about anything else.
Yep.
So one of the things...
Anyway, we've been steamrolling over you, and that was a great point, so I was trying to hand the baton back to you.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, and again, we're talking about world building and examples. The one that came to mind was Total Recall, and the complete control of society on Mars, all the way down to the distribution of air.
Yeah, which doesn't, I mean, if you look at it hard enough, it doesn't really work because the corporation doesn't have any reason to care about that. The corporation in Total Recall cares about the mining.
Right.
It's a fascist dictatorship because Paul Verhoeven hates fascists, and so his bad guys are always fascist dictatorships. But in that, the world building there didn't really hang together. The story was great, but it didn't work.
Well, there was one thing you said before. I don't know. You can go ahead, Rick. Didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just kind of half wondering and projecting what Musk's colony is going to look like if it happens.
So.
Well, I wonder because, I was thinking about that. The problem is Mars is such a hostile environment that any kind of colony you have out there is for a long time is going to be really dependent on Earth. Whereas the colonization of places like the Americas, you have a continent that's opened and there's people there. There are people who basically kind of went out into the hills and did their own thing, and there's whole cultures that came from that. That doesn't really exist on Mars. So I don't think Mars is going to become develop the same way that the colonies here in America did, or in Australia, or other different places.
I would expect Mars would have to be a dictatorship.
I could see Mars becoming organized much like we organized the research colony or station on the Antarctica, because until it can reach self-sufficiency, which I imagine, with enough dome habitats, with mining for resources, and with trees planted under the domes to create an oxygenated environment, like I could see it eventually reaching self-sustainability, but it's always going to be a fragile balance on the existence of life and death.
Yeah.
There's a difference, though, between what's going to happen on Mars and what would happen in Antarctica, because Antarctica does not have to ensure the perpetuation of its own population.
True.
Mars does. So there would have to be an incredible, terrifying amount of control over mating rituals, mating habits, procreation, everything to do with sex. It would have to be a completely different type of environment for that.
And to take off on that, what happens with the evolutionary cycles based upon the difference in gravity, radiation exposure?
Yep.
Pick your
the island effect. Yeah, and the island effect.
Yeah.
Right. And small populations on an island, that are blocked off geographically, they evolve at a staggering rate. Same is true for civilizations. One of the reasons that China stagnated was China was too successful in uniting itself. There wasn't the interstate competition, so the cultures didn't evolve either.
Well, uniting and isolating.
So you actually see that in the perfect example of that was both Star Trek and Stargate. Every time they go to a planet, now it was budgetary constraints, obviously, but they'd go to these planets and there's like less than 500 people, but they've got thriving colonies, and that's not enough genetic diversity. And you got to factor that in when you talk about colonies. Now, the argument I've seen against that is, well, if you're futuristically advanced enough that you can get there, then you've come up with ways to compensate for that, right? And it's a cop-out answer. I think the realistic is, humans are sort of like cockroaches. We just expand. Well, there would be some bigger colonies.
Well, I think maybe that both are true. I mean, we can literally do genetic engineering in a garage now. With a couple minor advances in vitro, from where we're standing now, you could genetically engineer the entire amount of human diversity into a very small population, or even expand it, and then just let the locals mate naturally as long as they get genetic screening, and you cull the mutations in vivo.
The
before birth
makes for an interesting mechanism for driving that.
So one of the things, back to what Rick said with the idea of corporate colonies. Now, we used Mars as an example of one that we might see in the near future, but let's take Mars out of the equation and assume we find other planets that are hospitable to human life, where we don't need to live in some sort of sheltered dome where every breath of air is a achievement of dedication to survival. So we'll assume like an Earth-like planet. You take that where you could get a colony planet. Do you see the concept lasting? I would see almost an inevitable revolution cycle, because at a certain point in time, you have no ties to the motherland that sent you there, and screw you, I'm gonna take my ball and go home.
Well, I think you need to have. I think you do need to plan for certain kind of governmental revolution cycles, no matter what, because except in rare instances, there are always going to be upheavals. But in particular to what you're talking about, Steve White and David Weber in the Starfire series, built off the game Starfire, did that with a book called Insurrection. It's I think it's David's second novel. And it talks about that in that universe, which was designed around two star empires fighting. they have to, in order to fund the expansion of the Terran Navy, they have to have these corporate worlds, very specific and called corporate worlds, to help build that. An insurrection is that exact revolution cycle you're talking about. So,
well, there's a rule I found that holds true, as far as I can tell, across all times, all cultures, all peoples, and it's a basic rule of human organization, and that is I against my brother and I against my cousin, my brother, my cousin, and I against the world. And what that means is that in the absence of some kind of external force that is putting pressure on you, that threatens you, you will eventually turn against each other. That we can, as humans, we kind of live in these concentric circles of like allies, right? So like you might have a dysfunctional family, but then if like somebody's like threat from the outside is threatening, you guys all band together and you guys face what's threatening your family. And then outside of that, I mean, it's kind of like well, and Daniel, you were talking earlier about how if there were a real alien threat threatening the United States, or not the United States, but the whole world, in the face of that, we would pretty quickly organize as a planet to basically, we would form this one world government and try to face it. Because all the bickering and everything, we'd have to put that aside because we're facing an external threat. And it's just kind of the way we humans are.
Or at least a unified command structure to deal with the threat and then go back to fighting each other.
So
yeah, you can't do that to us. Only we get to do that to us.
So would you see it more as a one world government, or more like the United Nations Space Force or something to that effect?
Yeah, more like that probably, because to get everybody together fast, you'd probably have to do that. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like, I mean, the UN was kind of like an early attempt at trying to form this one world government, but like they didn't really get past, just what they have here, because I mean, it's humans, and thank goodness they didn't, because I mean, I'd hate to live in a world where they actually succeeded, the Fabians and everybody else. But yeah, no, it's and I think trying to figure out what are the basic rules of how humans work and how politics works in general, and then kind of trying to have those inform your work as you go forward can be really useful. But I found that to be a particularly useful one.
And one of the things I heartily suggest, if you're doing world building for yourself, anytime you create a different culture, especially an alien culture or a different fantasy race or whatever, that you look at all the things humans do and then find something where you can turn the dial to a different setting, so that they have a different set of reactions based upon the expectations of what humans would do. Frederick Pohl's Heechee series comes to mind, where there's some of that, and I've seen it often done. But give your aliens or your other races and cultures something different, so it's not simply, well, it's Joe Schmo over here versus John Schmo over here, and there's no real difference. Give them reasons to make different decisions based on the same evidence.
The left side of his face is black.
Right. Yeah, there you
Star Trek Day. Sorry.
But I mean, you can see this this exact sort of thing playing out in China in the war, but the ideological war between the legalists and the Confucianists. Same set of facts in a very stable civilization, and these two minorly differing philosophies make such a difference that you have entire eras of Chinese history that go one way or another in terms of how united the country is, how open it is to trade, how productive it is, how vital it is, as opposed to how staid, just on the basis of those minor differences between those two ideologies.
And as long as you're consistent with your other culture thinking that way, the readers will follow along with it. But if you start flip-flopping on it, that's the other thing. If they're making decisions that aren't based on the way we normally do, but then they suddenly choose to do that, well, then you're confusing the readers, and then all sorts of bad things happen.
So we've talked a lot about this and made applications to way it might work in future sci-fi type settings. And I'm guilty of that because that's what I write. That's what Dan writes. That's what Rick writes. But Rob and Joe, you guys also write fantasy. So how do you think this kind of stuff would apply to a purely fantasy, whether magic heavy or not, but a purely fantasy setting?
I absolutely think it all applies, because we're we're talking about different scales, and we're talking about different technologies. If you look at magic, it's a set of technologies. But for me, I write characters, and then I put them in situations. And whether those situations have to do with pew, 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 or zap, zap, zap with the magic missiles, those are just particulars to how they're going to react. I want characters. So all the settings work for me.
Well, we're talking about things like transportation and things like communication. I mean, those are true also in history, and you can glean a lot of things from history. For example, like the one of the reasons why the Romans were such a powerful empire and lasted for so long, and their transportation. First of all, they controlled the Mediterranean Sea, which they called our sea, and basically, that was in the ancient world, seafaring was a major way to transport goods from place to place, and so that
And
was
armies.
a large. Yes, they also had. They built an amazing road system through the whole network there, so they were really good at logistics with that way, with maintaining things. They also turned it into. They kind of federalized it a little, where like each province, or I forget what they would call it, but in each area of the Roman Empire, you would have like a city, and like the large city they would get trade goods from all over the empire. So, and then then if you wanted your goods, you would then go from where you live in the countryside to that city. So then you could have like, olives from Spain, or, wine from other, different places from Italy, or wool from Britannia, and they would all be in the cities. And so you can take things like that and try to extrapolate it into what a fantasy setting, more like a medieval type setting, would be. One dynamic that I find really interesting, and talking also about technology, for a long time throughout history, the horse and the horse archers were an amazingly powerful and dynamic military aspect. And this is why you have these, because the way the Eurasian landmass is situated, you have on the periphery, you have kind of the rich areas. And in the center, you have the steppe lands, which is great for horses and very wide, but it can't support a large population. And so there's this dynamic throughout history where the people who live in the steppes would, they'd be successful for a while, and then they get so populous, they had to expand because they couldn't stay where they were. So then they would form tribes or tribal confederations and then attack the people on the periphery. And because the horsemen were so much more powerful than the infantrymen for most of history, they would be able to well, yeah.
They would, and the largest empire in history before the British Empire was Genghis Khan's empire, and it was formed over the course of 8 years by Genghis Khan and a couple hundred horsemen just riding everywhere and raising and raping their way across Europe and Asia, to the point where even now today, 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 people from Eastern Europe carry Mongolian DNA.
Yeah. Well, the really interesting, and I love talking about like Genghis Khan and stuff. It's really interesting. The interesting thing is, if you look at Genghis Khan's biography, he didn't really set out to conquer the world. He grew up in a really terrible situation, and he basically was like, kind of like Ender. It's like, I want to make it so that this war is not going to happen. He was basically the real Ender. And he's like, I'm going to make it so that like his dad was killed and his mom was being raped by his half brother. And so he teamed up with his other brother to murder his half brother. And then that caused the tribe there because he wanted to make sure this would never happen again. And so then that caused the tribe to basically enslave him. Then he had to escape. And then he did this other thing. But every step of the way he did it, he basically just wanted to set things up so that he and his people could be safe. And what it turned into is like he would think he was safe, and then somebody from the outside would come and attack him. And he's like, okay, I have to totally reorganize the society and unify the Mongols and actually do what I need to do. And then, the Khwarizms would basically, anyways, I could talk about it for a long time. It's really fascinating.
Well, and let's talk about the source there, because here's something for writers. If you want great story fodder, go read The Secret History of the Mongols. The translation that I read it from was Victorian, so it cut back on a lot of the fun, gory details. But even in that Victorian one that I originally read it from, there's so many great story ideas, so much energy, exactly all the things Joe was talking about there. The Secret History of the Mongols is a really interesting document to read.
Well, go ahead.
One of the things that's really important for or if you want to get good at world building and whatnot, is to read the local sources with a disinterested eye. In the West is a very moralistic civilization, and that has a lot of advantages, but it has the major disadvantage of it gets in the way of understanding how things work. And if you're reading like Genghis Khan, obvious, or Tamerlane, big monsters in history, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, oh my God, monstrous deeds, absolute horrible stuff that they did. But if you want to understand how they affected the world, you actually have to look at what they did and why on their own terms, suspending your moral judgment until you understand the phenomenology and the dynamics. Then you can bring your moral judgment back in. And it probably won't change because the judgments you have are, even if they're wrong, they're formulated on a great deep well of cultural knowledge that you're not going to trade away simply because you understand something. Voltaire was wrong. To understand all is not to forgive all, but it is to understand and to do a better job with world building and analysis and other things like that.
And not just and following on to that, the more you understand of period sources, for example, if you read Beowulf, again, you get all these wonderful story ideas, and
Wonderful.
many of them are gruesome. The whole Finnsburg thing where they basically killed a family by putting them in a longhouse, blocking off both ends and lighting the longhouse on fire. I mean, that's
George R.R. Martin's made a lot of money recreating a lot of those types of massacres from history.
Exactly so, from history. And history has every kind of story idea. The only thing you have to worry about when you're looking at history for story ideas is that history never has to make sense. Unfortunately, fiction does, or your readers go, what?
And what the other thing you have to worry about reading history is you have to remember that all history is polemic. Even the primary sources and the diaries of the people who actually moved the world, all of it's polemic. Everyone is trying to justify either why the losing side was actually the good guys or why the winning side deserved to win and was favored of God.
And if they didn't do it, the editors did.
Well, and the reason for that, I think, is because you have to have a story. Like, in order for politics to work, for geopolitics to work, you have to have, like, the people, in order for the people to be united and to go to war or to build a nation or to do things, there has to be a common story that they believe. And so you have to create a narrative.
Yep.
And, like, I mean, with the Mongols, for example, after Genghis Khan had already conquered a bunch of nations, his descendants and people, they created this myth of, the great god, sky god Tengri has basically wants us to unite the family of nations, and and he's granted this unto the Mongols to be the ones to unite us. So a lot of times it's like the ruler or the people want to go in a certain direction. They create a story, and that unifies the people to be able to do it. And
and of course the other thing is, like, when you're reading Roman history, where you can see it really loud, the people that wrote the history, or it also happens in Egyptian history, the people that wrote the history are the academics that are the toadies of the succeeding administration. So they want to make the last guys look worse than they were, so they can legitimize the current administration in the eyes of the intelligentsia and literate public of the current era. And we see that a lot in our own world too.
We do, but there are instances where that's what you say isn't true, but it's when they are looking back farther.
Yes.
Suetonius comes to mind, looking back into in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, which of course gets copied by Einhard in his or in his biography of Charlemagne. But you said something earlier that we all have to remember. The part that you said where we have to look at it in their terms. The biggest bias that we have to face as historians, and one of the things I think we've done a crap job teaching historians to do, but the biggest bias you'll ever find if you're trying to do history is yourself. And if you can't get past your skewing of the data, at least try to. You're never going to completely defeat it. But the fight against defeating that in historical terms is worth the struggle.
Yeah, and it skews along three lines. It skews along ideological lines, i.e. your philosophy of how things ought to be. It skews along moral lines, your idea of how people ought to behave. And for those of us in the post-industrial West, it skews along material lines. people before the Industrial Revolution, or even in the early Industrial Revolution, were under a completely different set of mental constraints than we are. The world, every part of the world, from the material level on up, was different. Our relationship to the land was different. Our relationship to time was different. Our relationship to reproduction was different. The reasons and arrangements around marriage were different. Everything was different. And when one of the biggest problems that you see in people writing historical fiction is they project, even they often will project a contemporary attitude towards ideas like freedom back on to a great example of this is Braveheart, right? Braveheart's all about freedom.
No,
What we understand as freedom is not what the Scots meant.
No,
It's not at all. We understand freedom as post-revolutionary individual liberty, blah, 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 based on English common law. The Scots wanted the clans to continue to run the clans.
Yeah.
And that is a completely different conception of liberty.
And another example of that would be another Mel Gibson movie where he did The Patriot, where they have that famous scene in the Spanish mission that's in the swamps, which is actually filmed in outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And they're talking about the freedom of slavery. It's very anti-slavery, basically post-Civil War era mentality that just didn't exist back then.
No, it really didn't. Even among slaves were all through the colonies at that point, even in the North.
And at that point in time, it was mostly the writers of the show trying to extrapolate modern values. And that's a problem we have with modern societies. We want to pretend that everyone's just like us, and they were, but they're also a product of their time. And you have to understand that people are products of where and when they were created, and that's going to apply to fiction as well.
Yeah, and in that instance, there's actually two layers of distortion. There's modern anti-slavery, which is based on which descends from the abolitionist movement, and the abolitionist movement itself is a reaction against the theological racialization of the slavery institution. That happened because the supply of indentured servants and slaves dried up in Europe. And so the slave traders had to go to Africa because what slave trade there was in Europe was being dominated by the Ottomans. So the Ottomans were raiding north, and there weren't enough slaves to come west. So the European slave traders got deeper and deeper and deeper into Africa. And when you're enslaving fellow Christians, there was this long-standing set of traditions and rituals and rationalizations that worked out there. But suddenly now you're enslaving pagan Africans, and well, they look different. And so you can get away with more because you can redevelop your theology around slavery to be like, these guys are less human. And you develop a new anthropology, and the racialization of slavery is what led to the abolitionist movement in the United States. And at the time, well, yes, but at the time that the Patriot takes place, that ideological program had not yet been completed. So the one-to-one equation of black with slave and black with inferior just didn't exist yet in the Americas. That was a generation later that happened.
Well, and talking about slavery, about the black African slavery, there's also a very large Muslim portion. Like a lot of them, they weren't necessarily going in and capturing slaves; they're buying them from Muslim slave traders. And Islam had a totally different system of how slavery worked. They had much more chattel slavery, and again, that grew out of the ideology. Because if you believe that you are these people aren't people of the book; they're subhuman. We can treat them. We can treat them like chattel. And then that came to America as kind of an import, and that's where why our slavery became so horrible. As opposed to the Christian slavery that was going on, or the European slavery, which was not quite as bad. I mean, the serfs were basically slaves, and that was most of Europe. But they were slaves.
Let's not. I mean, we're going off topic here, but let's not forget that one of the reasons why that racialization started was to keep, and you said indentured servants, to keep the indentured servants and the slaves from allying themselves
that's a good point. Yes,
and that starts all the way back in the 1600s. I mean, the Nat Turner's rebellion in 1670 or something like that is prompted a great crackdown on trying to make those two separate groups.
Yeah, but especially because of the mixing that happened in New Orleans and the way the slave trade was centered in New Orleans, that ideological program did not become universal south of the Mason-Dixon line until basically the 1810s, 1820s.
So my understanding of it is that, and I could be mistaken about this, my understanding of it is that it kind of grew out of the racialization of it, kind of grew out of the Declaration of Independence, where there's kind of this cognitive dissonance of, we believe that God has created all men equal, and yet we have slaves. And so they're like, well, how does it? Well, it must be because blacks are not entirely. Yeah, and they're like, we believe in this principle, but which is completely at odds with what we're actually doing, and we have to find a way to justify that. And it kind of grew from there.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take it back into the fictional world. So if we were going to apply, the history of the world, there's all kinds of errors you can draw from that would make a fantastical retelling. And George R. R. Martin, like you said, proved that you can steal from history, give it a new skin, and make an interesting story out of it. So if you were going to create a fictional, either fantasy government or intergalactic one, where do you see the most fertile ground to steal from? I know there's a big push to legions and confederations because everyone did the Star Empire. But if you were going to predict trends, where do you see the next sort of trend in fiction going? And what are your thoughts on that?
You could follow the commercialization cycle and go with guilds as well, and the political power of guilds.
And guilds then become trade unions, which become, political power brokers too.
No, there's a difference. There's a difference between guilds and trade unions.
Yeah,
guilds exist to suppress the trade that they represent. It's to control the supply of skilled labor in a given among freeholders of different businesses. Trade unions are essentially labor vending corporations that do collective bargaining against corporations. So you can only get trade unions developing after the split between labor and capital, which doesn't happen in when the guilds are involved. Because the guilds exist to protect capital by restricting labor. But labor and capital are the same phenomenon.
Sorry, I keep stepping on you, Daniel.
Yeah, no, go for it. I have this thing where I keep almost finishing my thought and then pausing for a second, and that's.
And I thought you were done, and I was trying. No, I was
totally natural. I'm sorry about that.
Let's go back to Dune, where Frank Herbert used the guild system really well.
The Spacing Guild.
Yeah, and to create all sorts of back to what I was talking about, kinetic energy for all sorts of story ideas. Those guilds rubbing at each other and fighting for power and wealth, and combine that with the noble system, the Atreides and the Harkonnens, and now all of a sudden you have different types of vectors that are pushing to create their own control, along with,
and add to the mix of that the religious side with the Bene Gesserit, and
exactly so
infiltrating all of those components with their own larger machinations. Is that the right word? Yeah.
Yep.
You're absolutely right, Rick. And then get back to Joe's point about the scarcity issues of water and spice. On top of that, I'll use it because I have to, that melange of competing.
Nicely done.
Well, the really interesting thing about Dune is that the scarcity is actually artificial. I mean, there's one planet that produces the spice, and that's kind of by design. And then later, I haven't read all the books yet, but especially I think in God Emperor of Dune, there's a real question of who creating a scarcity of the spice. It's possible to create other Dune planets. It would take a lot of work, and it's kind of difficult. And I think that becomes
and the honored matres are actually doing it too.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I think that it becomes a
by heretics of Dune.
Or heretics, yeah, but it's artificial, and it's done that way specifically so the emperor, because the emperor wants to divide all of the Landstred houses against each other, and so he's like, I need mechanisms to kind of keep them from uniting against me, but and then he has the Sardaukar, who is his elite military unit that can maintain his, they can take any one of the houses out, but he can't do that, because if he does that, then they'll all unite against him. It's kind of the divide and conquer dynamic going on there, but he uses the artificial scarcity to maintain his empire. which is also very historical.
This is where we come back to Machiavelli, because one of the things Machiavelli was really good at was explaining the actual mechanics of creating a divide and conquer system of patronage while keeping the patrons happy. And it's a very interesting balancing act that he elucidated in there, and that the Venetians were very successful at for about 1,000 years.
Well, the British were super successful, but
yes,
that was the
British were very
British
successful too.
In fact, if you subscribe to the idea that the British recolonized us with World War I, and the deep state and everything, and then they're kind of doing it to us right now. So there you go.
Yeah, it gives the British a little too much credit. A monster of our own making.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah, so-
technically, it would be the Germans, because that comes from Hegel and Marx.
Well, if you want to get really
dialectic
conspiratorial, then you can say, well, what if Hitler was basically just a creation of MI6 who went rogue? I mean, there's one.
Okay. So here we go. Now we get into the putsch.
Now it's
okay.
on.
So here we go.
Yeah.
World War I. You can't understand World War I and the Russian Revolution unless you understand German politics, because Lenin was in jail in Germany in 1916.
And somehow magically he ends up on a train and then in Russia.
Yeah, because the Brits and the Germans figured out that if they could make the Russians go communist, then they could divide up Europe. And so British intelligence worked with German intelligence to get Lenin into Moscow and to fund him.
Yeah.
And then they lost control of the situation.
I don't think it was an endorsement of communism and saying them communist as much as it was to simply destabilize.
Yeah, to destabilize Russia and to get rid of Nicholas. And
that the Rothschild.
There's also a family connection here, family intrigue, because all of the potentates in Europe, including in Moscow, were all nephews of Victoria.
Have any of you guys read the Nikki and Willie letters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
God.
And they all stayed at peace more or less as long as Victoria was alive. But as soon as she died, they all had long-standing grudges about who was Victoria's favorite nephew.
Yep.
And that drove a lot of the political intrigue that led to World War I.
Well, the conspiracy that I've been really interested in is that World War I, all it really accomplished was completely scorched earth, destroying all of the previous political order with all the royalty and everything, which had made it fertile ground for the Fabian socialists and for these other guys to kind of do their project. I think maybe they were orchestrating it. And you look at what was the one monarchy that actually survived that was really powerful.
Right. So this is another interesting. You're on top of another interesting dynamic in geopolitical machinations. There's a difference between orchestration and opportunism.
Yes.
That is true.
The Fabians, the great strength of the Fabians throughout history is they are tremendous opportunists. But the only time they ever got into power to organize something was World War II. Before that, they were on the edges, and they were able to capitalize on events that were going on to advance themselves into positions where they could control the levers of power. But the big decision makers on the table weren't the Fabians at the time. They were the Fabians were 2 degrees out especially in Britain, where they had the most influence. But the old royal houses, the interfamilial competition, the long-standing interstate grudges, which go back to the beginning of the Reformation, all of that was heavily in play in World War I.
Oh, yeah. Well, the British in general are master opportunists. I mean, how they built their empire. I mean, like,
oh yeah,
there's like the Germans had a better military structure and a more powerful military, but the British, like, they knew what they wanted, and they just, with an expedition, like, there's a talk by Hugh Nibley called Leaders and Managers, where he talks about this, how the Germans were master managers, but the British were actually leaders, and they were able to, he kind of, as an offhand comment, he mentions that the British basically conquered the world with an expeditionary force because they knew what they wanted, whereas the Germans tried to, like, micromanage their military through management to produce the best leaders possible, and then they never really got off the ground. I mean, they did get off the ground, but it didn't become as powerful.
And that goes back to
the Germans failed twice because of supply chain management.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lack of raw materials to sustain their goals.
Mm-hmm. And that all goes back again to the 30 Years' War, because the German managerial culture grows out of a reaction to the 30 Years' War, because going all the way back to the medieval era, anytime Germany gets too powerful, the French, the Dutch, and the British all gang up on them.
I
Because
against
Germany,
my brother and I against my cousin, my brother and I against.
no. Much more basic than that. Germany has so much wealth and so much human capital in terms of potential power that anytime they get to the point where they have a united autarchical system, they basically are in a position to run the world, because Moscow is only a little ways across, and Moscow's always had the population to do it. And so the history of Europe since the Middle Ages is the rise of Germany and everyone else freaking out and conquering them. And just they go up and they go down, they go up and they go down.
Well, and now we get back to the geo part of the geopolitical. You've got Germany as this potential economic powerhouse in the middle of Europe, but when you talk about the resources, a lot of the resources that were needed for a modern industrial society come from places like Indonesia and across the world, and that's where one of the things that we cannot forget about Britain is their excellent geographical position with respect to a global empire compared to Germany's, which has so many choke points that they have to deal with.
Yeah, so, if you look at the history of Britain, you really see how this plays out, because the British had a global empire before they had a united island. Because
it's like Europe. Europe conquered the world before
this is the right. Well, this is the reason for English common law too. Britain before the Canal Project was this series of disconnected city-states that were separated by swamps. There was no way to get stuff internally on the island except by going around the coast. So the interior was always very anarchic, very hyper-localistic. It wasn't.
I'm going to argue with that.
Okay.
The economics of the interior of England are quite strong earlier on. And now you may be talking about 1400s or 1500s. I'm not as strong in later English history, but the economic powerhouse that was Anglo-Saxon England, especially later Anglo-Saxon England, is really impressive.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not saying the interior was poor. I'm saying it was uncontrollable.
Well, this is why we have so many different actions, because there's so much isolation.
Right. You couldn't control it from the seat of government effectively enough to make it a German-style managerial system. So the seat of government along the seaports was able to conquer most of the world before it finished uniting its own island.
Yeah.
I think that's a topic that you and I need to share some beers over around a fire or something like that, because there's a lot of things in there. Well, and obviously we're talking here for an hour and a half so far, and we've covered some major topics. And the one thing that's true about history is that everything that you try to simplify is always more complicated. And then you find whatever layers of complexity that you can build into it, there's always another layer of complexity. It's actually one of the challenges as a writer you have to worry about, because if you build too complex of a structure, that is,
you can't tell a coherent story.
And your readers go, well, that's boring, and they put it down.
Yep.
Part of the genius of Frank Herbert was that complexity is there, but the story is so compelling that you can't put Dune down.
Yep. Well, one of the authors that I'm actually really impressed with is David Weber, where he's got all this world building, and he's got like the different empires and the dynamics and he's figured all that out, but he focuses specifically on the characters and each station or where they're at in the empire, in the thing. He's not focusing on the empires and how they're doing it as much as he is on how does this affect what the characters' decisions are and what their conflicts they're facing and how they have to navigate, how each character is navigating their world. So bring it back to the individual characters is actually really useful.
So I'm going to do a callback to Pillars of the Earth. It does exactly the same thing. You got the small fiefdom communities, and how are they interacting with the larger whole? and the switching of alliances from the Shire Earl, whatever the hell his name is, with Stephen, and then Maud, and then Stephen again, and who's taking what side. It's the same sort of thing, and it's incredibly brilliantly crafted.
Yeah, and the Pillars of the Earth is a really good example of a kind of fiction that only exists after World War II.
Okay.
When you have the Western championing of the commoner as a moral crusade, that's when you start to get historical fiction and even fantasy fiction like Lord of the Rings that's done from the point of view of the commoner. Before that point, any books like this are like Dune. They're about the ruling class and the ruling class's machinations. So you now have these two genres that you can transpose to any macro genre. These two ways of doing it: looking at it from the ruling class's point of view, or looking at it from the commoner's point of view, or if you're really ambitious and Tolstoy, trying to do both at once.
Well, or if you take Follett's next great effort, and that's the Century series, where he does.
Oh God, they do such a good job with that. He does such a good job with that.
It's a brilliant piece of work,
and much better than Follett's normal So one of the things that drives me nuts about Follett's historical fiction are the thought and language anachronisms.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so good with the Century series that I only wanted to throw the books against the wall 3 times over the course of 3,000 pages. I've thrown books of his out the window for a lot less, like what was it, Hornet's Flight, where he had LIDAR in World War II when the word laser didn't even exist before the invention of radar.
Yep.
So the acronym couldn't have existed, and they're talking about LIDAR. I just right out the window.
Days of radar.
Yeah. So how would you, like, we keep going back, and I get it. When you're talking about trying to build realistic geopolitical organizations in your fiction, what else do you go with but how you know? But the one thing, which is I guess the angle on it we never approached, is we've covered it very human-centric. So what does this look like when you start applying, and I'm assuming you guys all have some time to keep going, what does that look like when you start applying it to completely alien, and not just human polities from away from Earth, be it fantasy or sci-fi, but actual alien creatures or monsters or fairies or whatever?
The perfect example of that is Highline, the Starship Troopers, and the insect-based hives.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't see as much from their perspective, though.
But we do see that kind of thing in Red Planet from the perspective of the Martians.
Yeah.
Same author.
The thing about aliens is there's really a spectrum of how alien your aliens actually are. And like on the one hand, you've got like Star Trek aliens, where it's basically they have, they're like humans, except they have a funny little thing on their nose or whatever. And then you have the aliens that are so truly alien, they don't think the way that we can possibly think. And I think a really good example of aliens that are so alien that they're just incomprehensible to us, or barely comprehensible to us, is Voyager and Night by C.J. Cherryh, which is she did some really weird things in that thing. But the thing is, the more you go towards the side of how they're making really, really alien aliens, the more they're not going to really be characters as much as they are kind of like a force
of
nature.
Story.
Yeah, force of nature. And so they have to be relatable in some way to, like, and the example they say is that, a lot of times the Japanese are more alien to us than some of the aliens in sci-fi. So you want to make them more alien than the Japanese are, for sure. But you figure out what actually drives their culture, their biology, what drives their life cycle, and then you kind of build up from there, is how I would say.
Another, I guess, test tube or petri dish capability or example of that is Andy Weir's Hail Mary.
Yeah, he did a good job with that. That was actually, but he started with the scientific constraints of the alien race there.
Very much.
Like, what planet do they come from? How is that going to affect how the society works? The fact that they use hearing, I think that they use hearing and they sing instead of they use vibrations. I forget exactly what it was, but because they can't see things. But the fact that they can't see things means they don't know that time dilation is a thing, because they've never developed a theory of light speed and stuff. So, yeah.
So again, you've got to give them things that they value that aren't necessarily things that we value. I mean, it's easy to say that every time you're going to write a story, it's going to be about sex or it's going to be about money or power. And if you're writing a human story, that's a great place to start.
Well, power.
what are those equivalents in the alien race? And if they're the same, then they're going to react in many ways similar to us, but giving them different things that they think is important, or is different wealth, or is different sexuality, that's going to change their society. And just sitting and imagining their way of handling it. In many ways, I don't know that there's a wrong way to do that, in the sense that if you come up with something that you think is cool and is consistent, then I think the readers will think it's cool if it's different. But it still, again, has to be consistent, because you can't mess with the readers. That's the one rule. You don't cheat the readers. Don't screw with them. Don't screw with them in ways that you shouldn't, I guess is a better way to put that.
Don't just say this is the way it is because that's the way it is. Like, have good reasons for it. And you don't have to have reasons for everything. You just have to have reasons 2 or 3 steps ahead of where your readers are going to be thinking.
Right.
But you got to understand your readers are going to want to, if they enjoy it, they're going to want to deconstruct it and really get into the nitty gritty of it. So
Now, Dan, you realize at this point you look like you're in the witness protection program.
Yeah, I know. I just went away to get another light so that I can be visible again here.
No, he's practicing his noir setting.
There we go.
There we
Aha. Now you can see me again.
you cast a magical orb.
Yeah, well, this is my writing porch. It's outside, and I've got enough light to write by, but not necessarily enough to shoot by, so I had to get another light.
Fair enough.
So, do you think when you start factoring this in that this becomes the geopolitics can be engaging if it's the main thing, or do you think this is more like the ingredients that make up the cake that people care about?
If your readers don't care about the characters, you're going to have a hard time bringing them along. I think like David Weber does a really good job of driving into the characters, and he builds it like the whole geopolitical situation around it. Or the same thing with Dune. Although Dune is less about the characters as much as it is kind of about the world that he's got there. I mean, we're interested in the characters.
I think the trick that you're right on top of is you do have to have a character, but the character doesn't necessarily have to be a human. It doesn't even have to be a person. It could be an organization. It could be a system. But if you're doing the system as your central character, then you have to follow the same rules you do for individual characterizations. There have to be understandable interests there, and they have to be an interest that the reader can invest in. So there have to be values that go with the interests that make them investable. It's much easier to do with characters. All of fiction is kind of like a magician's trick, right? The trick to verisimilitude is to make sure your reader doesn't look at the stuff that you didn't care to develop. Make sure they don't think about it. So you develop it as much as you want, and then you make sure that the reader doesn't look where you don't want them to look.
That's absolutely true. I give you an example of a really mild, kind of boring geopolitical thing, and in fact, in many ways, a very simplistic universe. And that's David Eddings' Belgariad and Malorian series. It's really fairly simplistic, very tropish, very standard stuff. And yet, the way they do the characters is so good that you know that you're reading some simplistic stuff. And you know that you've got these sort of monocultures, but you don't care because you're really invested in the characters. If you get your readers invested in the characters, and you don't mess with your readers, don't screw with them other than, plot, story, fun ideas, then they'll follow along with a lot of your world building. But the characters come first, just like Joe was talking about.
Okay. I think it's a good mix if it's done right, especially in space opera. I think that's the one genre that it sort of shines, where you get the intersection of the geopolitical landscape and the character arc, and if done well, it can be memorable and even life-saving. So I think there are examples out there where those become, but I do think you're right. If you don't care about the characters, it doesn't matter how cool the setting is. It just, and as an example of that is any one of those newer authors that turn their D&D fantasy setting into their novel, and it reads just like that's what they
God. Oh, I hate that stuff. So
did.
it's torture.
And it's very obvious that it's they got so into the world building, and we all start somewhere. So I'm not being harsh, but it's very obvious that's what happens when the world building mattered more and the cool things than the actual overarch of the story and of the characters.
Well, there's also a lot of award-winning fiction that's coming out these days where the author wants to make a statement about geopolitics or about politics general or ideology, and they create this story, and I just don't care about any of the characters. And also I might disagree with the ideology too, and that's kind of annoying. But like, if they do it well, even if I disagree with the ideology and the characters, even if I disagree with the ideology, if the characters are there and the characters feel real, like Ursula K. Le Guin, probably would disagree with her about most of her politics, me personally. But I really love her writing, even because she's always true to the characters and she makes her characters so rich. Whereas if all you want to do is make a statement, like a political statement or like create kind of a world but then you run the risk of really I'm just writing a crappy story, honestly.
Don't preach
Well,
to your readers.
Sorry, go ahead.
Don't preach to your readers. Nobody wants to be preached to. Even if I agree with what you're preaching, don't preach. I don't want to hear it. Yeah. I think most readers
are trick. Well, okay, so there's a trick involved. Again, back to the magician thing. The trick is that you have to have a story. It's more important even than characters is story. And what story? It's the journey. It's the journey of something. We'll call it a character, but it could be an ideology or a principality or a world or whatever. James Mitchell in The Source did a whole world, a whole region as a character. Worked really well. But it's the journey of maturation of whatever your central character is through adversity and reversal. If you pull that off at whatever level you're doing it, you can get away with a lot of stuff that you're not supposed to do. You can, because your preaching then doesn't become preaching, it becomes dialectic, and that's a form of conflict, and that's interesting. Your world building isn't showing a map, it's exploring a texture and a development of a world. A lot of the books that we've bandied back and forth, some of them do one or more of these things without having good, strong personal characterization. But they do it because they make the story interesting.
You used a term there that I want to follow up on. William Least Heat Moon wrote a book called Prairie Earth. Prairie Earth is 1,000 pages about a county in Kansas, Chase County, Kansas, which has never really had more than 4,000 people in it. It's 1,000 pages on this county. It's brilliant. It's hard to put down. It's really, really good.
I haven't read that. I'm going to have to read that.
He writes a bunch of stuff like that. River Horse, where he traveled around the country on all the rivers and on a boat, going through all the rivers, and then doing the same in Blue Highways. He's really good at that sort of thing. What he calls Prairie Earth, and I think this is going back to what you just said, is it's a deep map is his term, because his map includes not only the geology, the geography, it includes all the people that have ever been there. It includes all of the resources that have ever come out of there. It includes all of the ideologies that have ever crossed or gone back and forth or risen and fallen. And it's all there in this deep map. Now, admittedly, it seems like I say 1,000 pages on a single county in Kansas, how boring, except it's not. And it's really impressive.
Yeah. There's a genre of fiction that goes back to the ancient world called, moving into the realm of ideas, called the philosophical dialogue. You can see it in The Last Days of Socrates by Plato. A lot of Heinlein's later work is philosophical dialogue. And when it's done right, even though it is basically just a long sermon, it doesn't feel like it, because you're riding the highs and lows of the different arguments against different things. Contrast that with, say, for example, one of the worst philosophical dialogues that it's ever written from a literary point of view is Atlas Shrugged, because there's no counter argument. Ayn Rand is putting forward a vision of the good, but there's no real conflict. There's no real ideological conflict. There's personal conflict, and you can't have a book that's about ideology without having ideological conflict, or it becomes just a sermon. And that's not interesting, except to people who heartily agree with it and are desperate to have their worldview shored up.
What about Starship Troopers, though?
I was just discussing work with somebody else, and I have yet to be able to finish it.
Starship Troopers is one of Heinlein's. I'm writing a book on his later books right now. Of Heinlein's attempt at philosophical dialogue, the most successful are probably Time Enough for Love and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. The most interesting in their failure are Starship Troopers and I Will Fear No Evil. And Stranger in a Strange Land is kind of in the middle, because you get a bit of the argument, but he loses focus on whether he's trying to do a juvenile or whether he's trying to do a dialogue.
Where would you put Friday in that spectrum?
Friday's not really a philosophical dialogue. Friday's much more like Gulliver's Travels.
I always felt like there was an underlying current of the philosophy of her becoming human, or trying to become human.
Well, there's certainly a lot of philosophical depth in Friday, but Friday and Job are both they're both quest stories of a very loose sort.
Okay.
In both cases, it's about how the travels of the main character change their perception of what is good and what they think of themselves and their place in the world.
Okay, I'll buy that.
And let's go back to Moon as a Harsh Mistress for a second. The reason why I don't entirely agree with you on Starship Troopers, I think there's some value to that. But
well, I'm not saying I don't like it, but it's more like exploring a single idea rather than being a proper philosophical dialogue.
Fair enough. The way it works in Moon as a Harsh Mistress, however, though, is a technique that I use when I want to do exposition. Rather than just saying something, I try and put characters in positions where they have to ask questions. And what you have in Starship Troopers is you have this grand old wise guy on the hill, Bernardo de la Paz, and then you have not just one but three different.
Moon is a Harsh Mistress, not Starship Troopers.
Yeah, Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Sorry, you have not one but three different people who are questioning him and all of his ideologies in Wyo and Man and Michael. They're all questioning these things, and therefore he has to defend them.
Yeah, and they're coming from different angles, because Wyo's a communist, and Manny is a blue-collar anarchist, and Mike is a brand new awakened consciousness who doesn't know anything.
He's a child. He's a baby. And so you do, I mean, so in your construct there, we have constantly, we have Man saying, well, I don't think you're right. And then Bernardo saying, well, this is why I think these things. And so he's got a coherent thing that he develops. And I think from a writer's perspective, what you need to do, or what's good, is that you know all of these sub layers of things that you are putting in your books, so that if a reader ever asks you all the things that you want to do, that you can so you can defend it, but you don't necessarily always want to take them out. And when you were talking, someone was mentioning earlier about the kinds of books that just are the D&D thing that throws everything out on the table right away, and that exposition just bogs down, and you can't ever get to the story or the characters. And the exposition is there to serve those, and we got to be careful about making sure how we get that to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that creates meaning both in life and in stories is not facts, it's the relationships between facts. And the thing that a story allows you to do is to explore these relationships between facts and how these facts coming into collision change the nature of how you understand both of them, or more.
That's why we humans are drawn to stories, is because how we make sense of all these facts that don't make sense around us. And we have, and we have stories. We're surrounded by stories everywhere. We tell ourselves stories all the time. And we tell some stories that contradict each other all the time with the cognitive dissonance. And the interesting ways that happens is figures into things. And I think, I mean, with a lot of geopolitics, the interesting things are where it's like, we want to do this thing, so we create a story, but it has contradictions to the other things. It's like you create a story to justify what you're already going to do, and that leads to some interesting things. So
yeah, the one more thing on the ideological angle of geopolitics is it's really important when you're doing a geopolitical story, is when at least when all your characters are human, you don't have differing moral values. What you have are different priority rankings of moral values. All humans value basically the same things, but they value them in different orders. And
are you talking about hierarchy of needs, or are you talking about more of the moral?
Talking about hierarchy of values. So humans value the continuation of life. They value pleasure. They value survival. They value social solidarity. They value security, for example. They also value honesty and loyalty. Now,
is this
one culture. Say what?
Is this kind of like Jonathan Haidt, where he says like conservatives believe, like they value loyalty and purity, and then the liberals, they have like feeling, and then libertarians also believe in freedom. He breaks it down to about like 5 or 6 values, and he says where you are depends on.
So Haidt's work only works in a weird context, Western industrialized, rich, and democratic. I'm talking about a more basic sort of biologically driven set of values that every human group has to have to survive. But the way that those values are prioritized are different in different cultures, and that's shaped by the realities of their technology and geography. And there's a feedback loop between all three things.
So speaking of like how that it all intersects, one of the stories that I thought did a great job, and it's partly space opera, I don't know what all genres you'd call it in, but we happen to have one of the authors here who wrote that, which was the Outworld trilogy, the Star Wanderer series. So you had a believable geopolitical organization that made sense in the world you created, that the characters interacted beautifully with. So did you start with Jeremiah, your main character, or did you start with the world and then extrapolate backwards?
Well, thanks, Jared. Thanks for bringing that up. I started with a problem and try to figure out how is the world going to solve this problem. And it's the problem that we got back to earlier about if you have a bunch of outlying settlements and they're very isolated, kind of like with space travel, right? What are you going to do about the problem of genetic drift? Where if you have a small colony of maybe only a few hundred people and they're cut off, and the technology of space travel is such that you can't bring large populations, and you can't bring them, like it takes a lot of time to get from place to place. I guess before I started with the problem, I started with the world where it was, I wanted to write a space opera. I wanted to have an FTL technology. And so I developed the FTL technology, the rules based around that. And then I realized the limitations of the technology will create a problem. The problem is how do you keep these societies, these individual colonies that are spread out across the outworlds, how do you keep them from basically collapsing because of the genetic drift problem? And I thought the way that they would solve it is that over time there would be this tradition that they would have of the oldest son in the family would take his father's starship and basically do kind of a rite of passage where he becomes kind of a merchanter. He takes, trade goods from world to world until he finally decides to settle down somewhere, or he decides to just kind of basically spread his seed and basically have girls in every port, whatever. And then from there, I realized, if that's the solution, I could write a really interesting story about this character. And that's when the story jumped out. Once I figured out, well, if I solve the problem this way, that creates the potential for this thing. And then I decided to focus it all on the character, but the world building kind of informed the character, and the politics and stuff informed the character, but it was really just about the characters at that point. The other thing that really got me interested was I really wanted to write a story about kind of an accidental marriage. Well, about influences and stealing, right? I had watched Jeremiah Johnson and was really enamored of the love story in that movie. And I was like, and also there was also the Firefly episode where there's the accidental marriage with the girl who doesn't speak the language. And I thought that's just a really interesting conflict, falling in love with a person where you cannot talk like language wise. And so I had just, the life experience where I was at the point, I had just kind of, I was traveling through Georgia. I was doing other stuff at the time. And I was kind of in situations where not a lot of people spoke English, and trying to interact with people there. And so that really hooked me. And then I had two characters together. How do I get them together? What happens to them in this world as they're trying to navigate it? And the story just kind of grew from there.
So another example of the world building making sense in the culture, the geopolitics, and the character development was another. J.D. Sawyer wrote it. You might have heard of him. He talks sometimes. Was Hadrian's Flight, but it's written for a younger audience. My son absolutely loves it. You mailed me a signed copy, and he stole it the first week it got there. Still haven't seen it since. It's on his bookshelf, and if I try, he growls at me like a little dog. So you did something right. But so I'll ask you the same question. Did you start with the world building, or did you start with the character? Where do you think the values line up?
Well, Hadrian's Flight grows out of a larger series that I haven't released yet because it's one of those, it's a single story told over about 4,000 pages. So I've got to finish the whole thing in order to make sure it's consistent so that I can release it all at once. But Hadrian's Flight actually slots neatly into that larger geopolitical family saga. So the world building is pretty deep in there, especially the geopolitics. Hadrian's Flight drops into the middle of this world that I had completely developed, and I developed it basically by looking at how a viable, self-sustaining off-world colony or set of colonies is likely to affect the world island school of geopolitics. So it's centered around the first war between the off-world colonies and Earth, because that's inevitable. Hadrian's Flight takes place right in the middle of this, and I dropped the character is a son of a small business person whose parents try to send him away so that he won't get drafted because the war is coming, and he winds up in the middle of things anyway. But I took this pre-existing world that I had, and I dropped this character into it with a very, very specific and constrained set of skills that he would have gotten from working in his parents' shop. And those skills you get from running a small service-based business turn out to be really applicable in the world of espionage, which is what he winds up mired in, because it's all about reading people and bargaining and balancing interests against each other and flattering people at the right time. And he's suddenly pushed out into an area where these skills are all applicable, but in a small business, there's one moral rationale, which is you want to separate the customer from their money, but keep them happy. And he's dealing with people who have a set of interests that's completely different. He has no idea how to manage the ethics of what's going on, and so he has to muddle his way through.
Okay. So, Rick, you're relatively new to the writing game, but you've read a lot. So if you had to pick one example of a fictional property, be it fantasy or sci-fi, that got the intersection of characters you actually care about, but a geopolitical organization that made sense for the world in which it existed, what would you pick? Other than Dune, because we talked it to death.
Well, no, my callback then goes to Pillars, and actually the Kingsbridge Chronicles that he's built now, because there's like 5 novels associated in and around the development of this community. But Pillars, in and of itself, is a perfect capsule of exactly that.
Okay, and then I will forward the question to you, Rob, because I know we're approaching 2 hours, and if we go much longer, we might put the audience to sleep if they're not already snoring. If that's
we're all scintillating. We could go for hours.
We apologize.
I could, and we'll probably have to get the band back together and maybe find some other cool esoteric topics that only we care about, and if no one else watches, it's still content. But Rob, so if you were picking either something you've written, I know the only one I know that you've written that I've read would be your Lake Most Deep, but you've released that a few times as you've changed publishers. So do you remember the origin? Did you start with the worlds that you created, or did you start with the character and then build the world around the story?
I probably started with the world, but I didn't start it from the way that you're thinking. I started it because I did an archaeological dig in Skopje, Macedonia in 2006. And it's a very interesting place. It's a very deep place, and in terms of all the history that's been there for thousands and thousands of years, and you can kind of see it there. There's palimpsests and and strata of history that just randomly sort of appear there. And I started with the town of Ohrid, Macedonia. It's a beautiful town. It's got over 370 shrines and churches, one for each day of the year that you can pray to a different saint. It's by one of the deepest freshwater lakes in the world, Lake Ohrid, and it's the history there that's come by it is fascinating. So I started with that, and then I went to characters, and then I went to world building. And so my world building went from, so I've got this place in Macedonia. Let's do something in a fantasy version of the Balkans, because again, there's so much kinetic energy in Balkan history. And because I wanted to write medieval-esque fantasy, I went to the Byzantines and then built out of that. And so just everything just started to build. Well, I want to do this, and then I'll add this, and then I'll add that. And that's my normal writing style. I just start, well, this sounds like fun, and then what can I add to it, and what seems like it fits, and that's how my world building went. But it basically started from the town of Ohrid, Macedonia, honestly.
Okay. And if you were going to recommend for creative types, whether they're doing it for their own headcanon or they want to, decide they want to do writing, if you guys were recommending the one book to read to understand the confluence of politics, culture, and basically everything that is geopolitics, what would you recommend them reading? Let's send them back to school, people.
Dune. But you have to read it 3 times before you understand it.
At least.
Okay.
3 times.
All right. So we're definitely going to have you back. But as we're wrapping this up, we're going to give each of you a chance to tell us what you're writing, and then, because this is going to be released in November, even though we pre-recorded it. So what you're writing, and you can project if you need to, and then how readers and listeners can find you. So we're going to go just in sort of round robin order. Rick, what are you writing at the moment, and how can they find you?
Well, I've just finished writing the first book in the Genesis Renewed saga, and I will have it and Tunguska available for sale and autograph at the Rave at 20 Books in November, if anybody wants to come on November 10th. And I'm just now kicking off book 2 in that series.
Okay. Get with me after the show with a link to that writing thing you're doing, and I'll throw that in the show notes because this will air the first week in November.
I'm sorry, writing thing I'm doing.
The Rave?
The Rave thing.
Yeah, it's the last day of 20 Books
Okay.
to 50K in Vegas. Yes, I can send you a link.
Outstanding. All right, Rob, what are you writing, projecting forward, because we're airing this in November? And then how can listeners find you? Oh, wait, hold on. Rick, did you say how they could find you?
Well, it's right there in my label. But obviously this isn't going to be visual for some folks who are doing the podcast only. So the easiest way to find me is rickshaw.com, or for all of my social links, go to linktr.ee/rick.shaw.
Outstanding. All right, Rob, what are you writing, and how can they find you?
As of the publication of this, I'm actually rewriting an entire series of epic fantasy novels that I'll be publishing early in 2004. Those are part of my Firehall sagas, and when this comes out, I'll be releasing book 4 in the Firehall sagas at that time, which I believe will be Farewell My Ugly will be out at that point in time. I'm in the midst of finishing it right now.
I love the title.
Yeah, that series happens to be Raymond Chandler in my Tolkien world. It just happened that way.
You may have just won a reader, man. Send me a copy. I'd like to read it and maybe blurb it. That sounds right up my alley.
All right, I sure will.
And I think you mean 2024. Otherwise, you're going to time travel.
What did I say?
2004.
No, I thought it said 24. Yeah.
I mean, time travel would be cool. We're going to have a panel on time travel, and I know some of you have expressed an interest in coming for that episode.
My God,
all right.
2004, I hadn't even gone back to get my doctorate at that point. I just got my master's degree. But you can find me at robhowell.org or firehallsagas.com. Obviously, I am at Rodri2112 on Twitter. Frankly, if you look at me on Discord or on Twitter or on Facebook, if you look up Rodri2112, that's me.
And all of those links will be in the show notes as usual, dear listener, dear viewer. Next, we've got Mr. J. Daniel Sawyer. So what are you writing at the moment, and then how can they find you?
I'm currently working on Volume 10, the closeout for my Clark Lantham Mystery Series, which is a series of techno-thrillers that jaunts through the different subgenres of mystery and has a hard-boiled tone. That's called Extinction Tango. That should be out sometime early in 2024. I'm also working on a nonfiction book called The Art of Agency, which is an exploration of liberty, freedom, and responsibility, and how one can reclaim such things even living in a culture like ours. And I have no idea when that's going to release yet.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
And you can find him at jdsawyer.net, and all of his links will be in the all of his social media links will be in the show notes.
Yeah, there's way too many of them, so check out the show notes or I'll just swamp the rest of the show.
And an hour later, he finally finishes between him and Rob Howell. But last but not least, we got you, Mr. Joe Vasicek. So what are you writing at the moment, and then how can listeners find you?
So I just recently published the second book in the sequel to Star Wanderers, which is the novel we kind of talked about earlier with the world there with the outworlds and everything there. The sequel is the second book in the trilogy is Children of the Starry Sea. Working on the third book. One of the projects I'm really excited about right now that I'm working on is Christopher Columbus, Interstellar Explorer. It's about this guy. It's a bunch of short stories I'm going to collect together, but and it's under my pen name J.M. White. But it's about this guy. He's this far future kind of. He starts off as an asteroid wildcatter. He chops off all his limbs and gets kind of mech implants or sockets so that he can put mech implants in them. And the stories are about his run-in and adventures with the warrior monks and warrior priestesses of the Church of Jesus Christ of Post-Millennial Saints Orthodox, and their travels across multiple dimensions in time. So that's the kind of the crazy world there.
That could be fun.
It was a lot of. It's been a lot of fun. It's going to be. I'm really interested to see where it goes.
Yeah, his pen name, the J.M. White pen name, is his separating people that might get offended by some religious themes and just throwing it in a different pen name, so you can pick and choose as you so desire.
Yeah,
it gets weird. Go ahead.
Because you won't do this, JR. I'm going to turn around and ask, what are you doing right now?
What are you doing right now?
So I have a couple things. I'm writing a series with James M. Ward, and it's tentatively it's going to be a Wargate book, but I got to send that to the publisher and see what they think. But it's the conceit. I'm in the second book. Is modern to my time, so 2004 2005 timeframe. A modern striker brigade goes to Egypt on a. The idea is we find the second Valley of Kings. Egyptologists suspect there is one. We just haven't found it. If the grave robbers haven't found it first. And so that is discovered right about the time of 2003 to 2005. There's a lot of Palestinian terrorism that's happening in that region. It's minor, but I would imagine if they found the second Valley of Kings, it kicks off even more based on their actual targets of the time. So they go there to protect it, and they get sucked into fantasy Egypt where the gods are real. And Set and Horus are fighting. And so that's that series. It's called the Cursed Brigade series. Book 1 is Operation Kopesh. That is written. It's with the editor. Book 2 is Operation Serpent Strike. I'm about a quarter of the way. It was one of those ones where we didn't plan our outline well enough, so I had to dump a huge chunk. I hated that. I cried inside. I died inside a little when I have to throw away words, people.
Well, that's what the
You don't
sequels
throw
are
them
for,
away.
right?
You just save them for the next book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, they're in a file that I can raid. Hopefully, I'll be able to use it because then I won't be as dead inside.
And they inform the rest of the world you're writing in.
Yes. And so we've got that series, and then I'm co-writing another series with him at the same time because he got bored waiting for me when life happened to keep writing because I'm first drafting it because I've got the military experience, and then he's layering on his years of research into the gods and all of the ancient cultures that informed the original D&D stuff. So he started writing a fantasy series called The Wizard Ascending, and it's basically if you took the core that was the D&D game back in the day when they were developing the system, you port that forward to modern times, and then the readers get Portal Fantasy. They get sucked into the game, and I'm having a lot of fun reading that. He's writing the first draft of that one, and I'm second drafting it. We're halfway through the first book, and it's tentatively a trilogy. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Very cool.
no clue when those are going to come out. I had some life stuff happen that slowed me down. Had to get a real job for a little bit to pay some bills. It's funny how that happens. So that's what I'm working on. But you can find our podcast, dear listener, because we also have one of them there, link trees. So it is linktr.ee/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChute, the Rumble, the Madam Stabby Stab, where you can send all of our hate mail. And if she makes you cry, that's on you. You knew what you were getting into. We are on the Twitters at SF_fantasy_show. We have an email for all serious inquiries only now that we've got somewhere for your hate to go is blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. The Facebook group is /groups/Blasters and Blades podcast. I am told I mix up where the backslash and the front slash and all the slashes go. So just do what you know to do. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
It's just
Everything on the internet is front slash because it's a Unix system.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll just say slash. I've been saying backslash my entire gosh dang life. Okay,
That's because you're a Windows user.
slash is all mixed.
And then we have our website at anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on. Speaking of the lovely Mr. Shaw, he is going to help us develop a proper website, which will redirect all the things to a website, a landing page. You could do the things. At some point, we might become grown-ups and get merch and stuff. It's been requested that we get some sort of T-shirt that has Madam Stabby stabbing her lovely husband, Mr. Nick Garber.
I would buy that.
And
Yeah, I'd buy that.
her catchphrase, which has been, the watchword of her life, which is "make it make sense." And how does that work? How does that even work? Is her two things she says when she watches movies and reads books. So that'll probably go on some merch because Nick doesn't have enough things to do. And you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. And be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast. I promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly caffeinated. They will drink until the java pulls out of their eyeballs. That was my Arnold voice. It didn't work very well, so I'll try harder next time.
Boys out of their eyeballs.
Yeah, that's a little better. We clearly do not have. Well, I clearly don't have a voice acting career. I know you do the Podio tracks though, so I won't insult you. So,
Well, I don't do impressions, so
that's a whole other business. Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you guys for coming. This was a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and we're out.